Okay, this is segment 2 of 3 for Monday's class, and we're picking up with the beginnings of the Spanish-American War. We just discussed the beginnings of the Battle of Manila Bay, but before we get to the details of that particular battle, I did want to mention something about the preparation for war and the United States response to the declaration of war. And it's a very interesting scenario because this is technically the first big military effort by the United States, actually since the Civil War. And so what seemed to grip the entire country at this point was what some people have called martial fever. One of the things to keep in mind is that many of the young men who fight in the Spanish-American War are the children or grandchildren of men who had fought in the American Civil War. And initially there's a strong push by many of these young men to become part of this war, to, in a sense, relive the glory that they had heard about all of their lives. But it was reflective of the country itself, which was very much in a positive frame of mind, and really, as we talked about earlier, believed that this would be a war that would be successful. This is the last American war where individual units could actually create themselves, arm themselves, and even outfit themselves and present themselves to be used by the United States military. Now, this is the idea of volunteer units, and many of them sprung up. There were many young men who hoped to get into this war that, because it ended so quickly, did not. And with volunteers and government call-ups, by the time the war actually ends, 270,000 Americans had been put under arms, although only a handful really get into battle itself. They're sent, as we'll see, to the southern states because that's closer to Cuba, and ultimately the location for the embarkation of most of the troops who actually fight in Cuba is going to be in Tampa, in Florida, although at this point in time Tampa, Florida is not exactly prepared for what they're getting hit with. We'll be talking about this as we move forward. Now, I did want to also mention McKinley's role in this, and as president, he's really the first president to act as commander-in-chief since the Civil War, as we talked about. He had served in the Civil War. He's the first president with what we could call a true war room, although Lincoln had begun that process. He does have one specific part of the White House that's dedicated to the war itself. He gets information very quickly, keeps track of everything that's going on. But one of the things that many historians like to point out is the fact that, as we'll see, McKinley makes it a specific point of making sure that at least one unit of African American troops is involved in the war itself, and in fact they will be on the ships that get to Cuba, and although they're segregated as they get into really the biggest land battle of the war, they're charging with the other units of American soldiers towards the Spanish enemy, and as will often happen during wartime, people get mixed up. And when this does happen and you have these sort of integrated looking units that are attacking the Spaniards, even though technically they're not, the press will comment on them quite notably. Of course, we talked before about the different areas where African Americans will begin to make headway and prove that the thoughts that many people had about them were not actually true, and this war adds to that. All right, let's get back, if we can, to our narrative, and we're talking about the Battle of Manila Bay. It was, again, very important that the U.S. stop the Spanish squadron in the Philippines from getting out into the Pacific, because it would be difficult to chase them down. They could do a lot of damage, just as the CSS Alabama had done during the American Civil War. And because of the forethought, and in fact a huge risk taken by Teddy Roosevelt, the American squadron under Admiral Dewey will actually show up just as the Spaniards decide that they need to break out and to get into the Pacific. And at that point, the American ships will actually block the passage of the Spaniards out of Manila Bay and send the Spanish a message that says, in essence, you probably want to go ahead and surrender because there's no way you're going to get out of here, and no way that you're going to be able to defeat us, pointing out the vast superiority of the American guns versus the Spanish guns. To put it in sort of layman's terms, the American guns could fire at least 1/3 farther than the Spanish guns could, so it really didn't make a lot of sense for the Spanish to attempt to break out. And yet the Spanish commander, as he said later, fighting for the glory of Spain, will go ahead and try and push his ships out of Manila Bay, really knowing what they were facing. And unfortunately for the Spaniards, what's going to occur is really more of a military execution rather than a contest. At least that's the comment that one observer from a European nation said about this particular battle. When the smoke cleared, all 7 of the Spanish ships had been sunk or disabled, with over 400 Spaniards either killed or wounded. There had been only one U.S. casualty, and that was a cook on one of the American ships who had come to the deck of the ship to watch the battle, and he actually died of heat stroke. So this was a huge victory for the United States, and with this victory they had wiped out all the Spanish naval presence in the Pacific Ocean, and a good chunk of what the Spanish had left as a navy at that point. Of course, immediately Dewey is elevated to heroic status in the United States. People name their babies, their horses, their hats, and there's even a candy that comes out called Dewey's Chewies to recognize his great success. Now, what's interesting is that this event, which again was prompted by a rather rash action by Teddy Roosevelt, which could have actually started the war on its own, but instead turned out to work perfectly, is something that then pushes the U.S. to move towards invading Cuba itself. The U.S. was really not ready to do this, as we talked about before, and America doesn't usually do that well in its first battles because we're trying to scrape everything together quickly. And as you can see here, the invasion of the island of Cuba will come from Tampa. Tampa had actually only 2 major docks that could be used to load ships, and really there was only one rail line that went into Tampa. Supplies and manpower and everything else came from all across the United States to Florida, but because of the lack of facilities, it backed up into Georgia, South Carolina, and other states, waiting to get to Tampa in order to be loaded. McKinley knew this was going to be a difficult situation, knew that we were not totally prepared, but the press and the American public were ready for an invasion, and so it's a very difficult logistical task to make this happen. So this is it makes it even more interesting that there is a specific group of Americans who manage to get on the ships, and they're actually led by none other than Teddy Roosevelt. You see the logistical problems that we have here. There is the African American group that you see down in the right corner, and you can see the map that shows how the United States moved to get into Cuba. The invasion force that's finally put together has approximately 17,000 men. It's the largest at one time to leave the United States for a military action, but there are massive problems with the landing. The ships themselves were not really packed correctly. There was all kinds of difficulty getting the right stuff on the right boats. The Americans did make one very smart move, and you notice that they didn't invade in Havana, which is located here, much closer to Florida, but instead went all the way around the southern side of the island and landed here at a city that is actually named Santiago. This actually took advantage of one of the things the Americans could do in the war, which was land their men anywhere, which forced the Spanish to prepare for the invasion at any point in Cuba. Now, there's great difficulty with the landing. As a side note, one of the 2 volunteer units, and there's only 2 that managed to get onto these ships and be part of the invasion, is the Rough Riders that are put together by Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt, as soon as the war began, resigned from his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His comment was, "I'll never become a hero commanding a desk." and instead he went about collecting a group of men and getting money to arm them and get them uniforms and prepare them to be one of the volunteer units. And so he put together what a very famous group in American military history called the Rough Riders. Now, this was a combination of some people that he knew in New York, including people that went to Harvard and Yale, and as well as some pretty tough people that he recruited basically off the street in New York. And he even recruited people all over the country. In fact, at one point he actually goes to San Antonio and collects some people there. But ultimately this group presents itself, and Roosevelt, pulling all the strings he possibly could, managed to make sure that his group did get on these boats. Now, what happens to them when they land is pretty typical of what happened as far as the entire landing was concerned. They had brought horses with them, but they had not brought transports to move the horses from the big ships to the beach itself. And so they in essence, pushed the horses overboard and hoped that they would swim into shore. And unfortunately, most of the Rough Riders' horses became disoriented and swam southward toward South America and were never seen again. But what happens when the Americans do manage to land is that they land, and then what is brought ashore are a bunch of crates that are supposed to have all their guns and everything else in them. And when they open them, it's July, it's Cuba, and they open the crates, and what they find is winter woolen uniforms and toilet paper. And that's because they just had not packed everything correctly, and everything had been done in such a hurry. What's interesting is that if the Spaniards had chosen to attack at this point, then they probably could have driven the Americans off the beaches and might have actually successfully defended Cuba. But because the Americans landed at Santiago, many of the Spanish commanders there believed it was actually a fake, and that the major thrust of the attack would come at Havana, so they kept most of their troops up there, which was very beneficial for the Americans. Alright, so the Battle of San Juan Hill. This is the one major land battle that occurs in the Spanish-American War, and it occurs on July 1st, 1898. Now, if we go back to the previous slide, the American forces land just a little bit to the east of Santiago and then march towards the city itself. The city itself had about 7 major hills that surrounded it, and in order to take the city, the American forces needed to knock out the Spanish forces that had fortified the hills around the city itself. The biggest hill that they're going to be attacking is a hill that in history has become known as San Juan Hill, although its actually official name was Kettle Hill. But the American forces will actually just make a full frontal charge up that hill when they probably could have surrounded it and waited for the men there to run out of food or something along those lines. But the reason they attack and go ahead and risk the casualties that could happen, and did to some extent, in taking that hill, was that as soon as the Americans landed in Cuba, they began to run into the same problems the Spanish troops had run into, which is all the diseases that were immediately affecting the American forces. In fact, the commander, General Shafter, was actually sick all the time that the battles were taking place. And those diseases were the tropical problems of yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery. And so, in a sense, this was a race against disease, because with each day the American troops who were there were actually becoming more and more ill. And so this is why the Americans will make this mad dash up the hill at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Now, it's a very difficult scenario. As I mentioned, the African-American units and the regular units became intermixed. The press made quite a big deal out of this. But at the end of the day, after 3 tries, the Americans finally took the one hill, San Juan Hill, from the Spaniards, who fought very bravely, and it was a very difficult battle. And for the Americans, they suffered 1,000 casualties, meaning killed and wounded, out of their 8,000-man force. This meant that if they were going to take the other hills, that things were probably going to get pretty dicey, because they were losing troops right and left. And I want to point out, as it says here on the slide, that at the end of that day, Roosevelt wrote a letter to his friend and said, "We are within measurable distance of a terrible military disaster." And so he really thought the Americans may not actually win at this point. But as we'll see as we open up segment number 3, that's actually not what happens. Instead, the Americans will be victorious.